Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely fascinating historical paradigm shift. We are heading back to 7th century Arabia to look at how a deeply entrenched patriarchal culture experienced some absolutely sweeping social reforms. We'll be looking directly at the primary texts and historical records to see exactly what kind of revolutionary women's rights Prophet Muhammad introduced, covering everything from spiritual equality all the way up to political agency.
Now, to do this right, we're grounding today's analysis entirely in verified academic consensus. We'll be drawing on peer-reviewed research from the International Journal for Multidisciplinary Research, plus the biographical work of prominent Western scholars on Islam, like William Montgomery Watt and Karen Armstrong. These scholars used a critical historical method. Basically, they moved past old prejudices to objectively look at the original 7th century texts and the profound shifts those texts actually triggered.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the age of ignorance, move into spiritual equality under God, then education and economics, marriage and family, political agency, and finally wrap up with a historical legacy.
Starting with Section 1, the Age of Ignorance, or Pre-Islamic Arabia. To really grasp how huge these coming reforms were, you have to understand the grim reality of the era. The baseline in pre-Islamic Arabia was incredibly dark. Women were literally treated as property, goods to be traded or just inherited by male relatives when a husband died. Patriarchal supremacy was the absolute rule of law, and female infanticide was tragically common. Newborn girls were sometimes buried alive just because they were seen as a source of shame or an economic burden. But then we see the dawn of something completely radical. These imminent Islamic reforms started recognizing women's full humanity, bringing in unprecedented legal rights, inherent dignity, and massive social protection. Which brings us to Part 2. Spiritual equality under God, the theological foundation. These reforms started from the ground up by completely redefining a woman's intrinsic worth. This was the bedrock for all the practical rights that followed. Now, what's really interesting about this specific verse from the Qur'an, chapter 4, verse 1, is that phrase, one soul. By stating that all mankind was created from a single shared soul, this primary text totally dismantled those ancient, deeply entrenched cultural ideas of inherent female inferiority. It established the fundamental theological premise that men and women share the exact same essential human nature and spiritual origin.
And this brilliantly illustrates the practical application of that theology. This verse meticulously lists out righteous qualities, being truthful, patient, humble, charitable, and it applies them equally to both genders. In a world where women were treated as property, defining them as spiritually autonomous was an absolute game changer. It reinforces that divine standards, virtues, and ultimate spiritual rewards are completely equal. A woman's spiritual worth was no longer tied to a man. It was direct, individual, and totally equal under God.
Moving on to Section 3. Education and economics, or the right to learn and earn.
So transitioning from the spiritual realm into the very practical worldly sphere, we see how these foundational beliefs translated into everyday empowerment. The very first step, education. Prophet Muhammad famously stated that seeking knowledge is a mandate, an absolute obligation upon every Muslim, making zero gender distinction. And historical records show this wasn't just a nice theory. Take Aisha, the Prophet's wife, for example. Because of this mandate, she became one of the most influential scholars in early Islamic history. She transmitted over 2,200 hadiths and became a highly respected authority on jurisprudence, medicine, and history, regularly advising the senior male companions of the Prophet. Now let's look at how this builds into the economic sphere. The financial rights introduced here were truly revolutionary for the 7th century. Women were suddenly granted defined inheritance shares, which effectively stopped the practice of women being inherited as property. The text gave them the exclusive right to their personal earnings and the absolute freedom to manage independent businesses. Crucially, Islamic law dictated that a woman had literally zero legal obligation to spend her own money on household expenses. That fell entirely on the husband. Honestly, a financial setup I'm sure many today wouldn't mind signing up for. We see this economic independence mirrored right in the life of the Prophet's first wife, Khadijah, who was a highly successful, independent businesswoman in her own right.
So the crucial point is how this financial independence was actively protected, especially during marriage. This brings us to the concept of the mahr. Unlike a traditional dowry that's paid by a bride's family to the groom, the mahr was a mandatory financial gift moving in the exact opposite direction, from the husband directly to the wife. Once it was given, it became her exclusive, independent property. It was basically a built-in tool for female financial security.
Next up, Section 4, Marriage and Family. consent, and marital protections.
These marital protections completely transformed the domestic sphere from a patriarchal transaction into a covenant based on mutual respect and consent. The procedural protections put in place were super structured. First, women were given the absolute right to consent to or refuse a marriage. Think about the historical shock value of this. There's actually a famous historical anecdote where a woman came to the prophet complaining that her father had forced her to marry against her will. The prophet immediately gave her the right to invalidate the marriage. Overturning a father's marital arrangement in antiquity? No way that was common. Second, women could stipulate legally binding conditions in their marriage contract, or nikah, like the right to continue working or studying. And third, they were granted access to initiate divorce proceedings, known as khula, giving them a clear exit from harmful situations.
That takes us to Section 5, Political Agency, a voice in the 7th century.
This is perhaps one of the most surprising areas of reform. We're going to explore the extent of women's engagement in the public and political arenas of the time. Now ask yourself, based on what we typically assume about the ancient world, did women actually have a political voice in 7th century Arabia? It's incredibly easy for us to assume the public square was exclusively male.
But fascinatingly, the historical texts say yes. According to the Qur'an, specifically chapter 60, verse 12, women forged a direct political covenant with the prophet. This was known as the bay'ah, and they pledged their allegiance entirely independently of their male relatives. The Constitution of Medina explicitly vindicated women's rights and dignity in civil society, and on a purely practical level, women's voices shaped major political events. For instance, the prophet's wife, Salama, provided vital diplomatic advice during the exceptionally tense negotiations of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Her advice essentially averted a major political crisis. It's truly incredible to see that level of direct influence.
Finally, Section 6, a historical legacy, reclaiming the original vision. Here is where we need to bridge the gap between these foundational historical texts and the modern world we live in today. Modern academic consensus, alongside a really fast-growing movement of Islamic feminist scholarship, points out a significant gap between these original 7th century ideals and contemporary realities in certain regions. When analyzing the text neutrally, these scholars emphasize the need to use independent reasoning to reclaim the gender egalitarian interpretations of the primary sources. They argue that a lot of the modern restrictions on women stem not from the religion itself, but from layers of later patriarchal cultural practices that just sort of overshadowed the original vision.
Because when you look strictly at the source texts, it is undeniable that comprehensive, systemic rights, the right to own property, the right to demand education, the right to political agency, and the right to consent were established over 1,400 years ago. These reforms were quite literally centuries ahead of their time, elevating women's status from property to empowered, active participants in society.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought to reflect on. We've seen the historical evidence. We've seen the rights clearly guaranteed by the original sources. So if these foundational 7th century texts guaranteed such revolutionary rights, why do modern cultural practices so often diverge from them? It's a really profound question about the tension between original ideals and human cultural implementation. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.